and welcome to the dungeon. I'm your host, Rob, and today we're going to be talking about mystery and investigation type scenarios. The video is going to be more geared toward dungeon masters, but there will be some stuff for players as well. And I should probably preface this by saying that I am by no means the expert on these types of scenarios. However, I have run several in the past, ranging everything from players being on the edge of their seat, waiting upon my every word, where every dead end players just started spitballing ideas and bouncing ideas off each other and kept driving the plot forward. And I could tell everyone was enthusiastic and everyone was fully engaged. I've also had scenarios where after 20 minutes of not getting anywhere, players all had those bored looks on their faces, people started playing with their phones, and the next thing is they just wanted me to stay with roll initiative because they'd had enough. So hopefully, like everything else, you can learn from what I've done wrong and learn from what I've done right, and in order to be able to make your own games even better. I'm going to spend a bunch of time talking about one particular game I ran, which was called The King in Yellow, and it was the end of a much, much longer chronicle, and I was actually the third player to be the dungeon master in that game. We'd started with the Mines of Phandelver starter set, and had gone through Storm King's Thunder. We'd done some homebrew stuff, and ultimately I ended up running Curse of Strahd, but I had to scale it up in order to account for the player levels. And I ended up running The King in Yellow, which, as the name would imply, was a Lovecraftian horror. And I just thought it would be a nice complement to the gothic vampire horror of Curse of Strahd, and then follow it up with Eldritch Lovecraft type horror. And so when the game began, the players were already 15th level and had access to a lot of high-level spells and a lot of high-level magic. And we'll be talking about the role of magic in these types of games as well, because it's Dungeons and Dragons, and, that's just kind of unavoidable. If you built your murder mystery to figure out that, who killed this certain individual, and then the players just cast Speak of Dead, and he's like, oh yeah, it was my brother who wanted the money, and he's at the inn trying to pack up right now. If you hurry, you can catch him. That suddenly ruins your entire investigation and your entire mystery. So I'm going to talk towards the end about spells and how to deal with those. But I also think it's important to understand that spells can be an important part of your game as well, as the dungeon master, of helping the players to solve the mystery. Because ultimately, you want the players to be able to solve the mystery. If your idea was just to not give them any clues and stump the players, then you could do so because it's your game. But the spells themselves and the clues that you get from them can be an important part of your game. And so we're going to talk a bit about that too. So to give you some background on The King in Yellow, basically the plot was driven around this evil cult worshipping the king, trying to bring him back from his imprisonment and destroy the universe. So pretty much just your generic evil villain plot, crazy cult type. The specific MacGuffin in this case was that there were 3 girls who had been kidnapped by the cult, and each of them had been magically tattooed with 1/3 of the ritual needed to summon the King in Yellow. And a group of paladins had managed to interrupt the cult when they were trying to do this originally, and one particular paladin had managed to save 2 of the girls and had managed to free them. One of the cult leaders escaped with the last girl, who would go on to become known as the Golden Queen, and would be one of the main villains of the entire chronicle. The game actually began when the players arrived in a town. They met a bunch of the NPCs, including the innkeeper. They met a bard named Rowan, who would become very important later on. They met the blacksmith and a couple other people, and then they met this old retired paladin, who of course was the man who'd saved the 2 girls originally at the attack on the cult mansion. He explained that his daughter, who was in an asylum, had been murdered, and no one was really interested in finding out who killed her. No one really wanted to even go to the asylum. It's not a very pleasant place, obviously. And so he wants the players to investigate and solve the mystery of her death. He also mentions that he has another daughter who had run away some time ago because she was worried that things from her past were starting to catch up and people were looking for her. And for his own protection, she had never told him where she intended to go, but he thought that her sister probably knew. So it's kind of a double investigation. Find out who killed the one girl, who we will refer to as the Scarlet Queen. I named all the girls after their hair color. And so solve the Scarlet Queen's murder and find out where her sister, the Ivory Queen, is. They're not technically sisters, of course, but they kind of treat each other as sisters. So the players went to the asylum, managed to get their way inside by convincing the person running the place that they were there to help, and they did an investigation. They interviewed many of the people, like the staff and people who were there working, and managed to establish a pretty accurate timeline of events and narrowed down the girl's death to a certain time frame. They'd also managed to befriend one of the guards who gave them another clue, which was a series of sketches that the murdered girl had made. And one of the sketches ended up being particularly relevant. It just showed this old, abandoned, what looked like a church or a cathedral of some sort that was clearly in a state of terrible disrepair. But the players didn't really know what to do with it right now. They also went to go talk to the murdered girl and to examine the body. They noticed that a large patch of skin had been cut from her back, Silence of the Lamb style, and so this was obviously a clue that whoever had killed her was looking for something very specific, either on her back or maybe just whatever. They weren't really sure what to make of this yet either, but it was another clue. I knew that the Warlock player had Speak of Dead and could actually cast it at will, which was a little intimidating at first, but I decided to go through in advance, and I'd read the spell, Speak of Dead, a couple times just to make sure I was familiar with it. And a couple of important things stuck out to me. You could only ask 5 questions. You could only cast the spell on one particular body once every 10 days. So even though the Warlock could cast unlimited uses of Speak of Dead, he could only use it on the murdered victim once per 10 days and only ask 5 questions. Another thing was that the answers had to be truthful, but didn't have to be straightforward. They could be very cryptic. And so, knowing all this in advance, I decided to use the possibility of this player casting Speak of Dead as one of the clues that would help lead towards the murderer. She didn't necessarily have to identify the murderer, she just had to identify things that would help the players identify the murderer. And so I decided that all the cult members always wore masks for these different meetings. And so the person who killed her had been wearing a mask. And so when they asked her who had killed her, she said, "The Weeping Man." Obviously, this wasn't helpful to the players at this time either. Basically, having run out of options now at the asylum, the players decided to start talking to some of the various townsmen that they'd already met. One of the people that they were suspicious of originally was Rowan the Bard. Now, in my mind, Rowan was actually going to try to join the party as a member and travel the world and seek adventure, all that kind of stuff. And so the party had actually used Rowan's willingness to work with them kind of against him and allowed him to become friends with them, they thought, and sort of befriended him. They actually paid his debt at the tavern where he owed like hundreds of gold because he was, kind of a scoundrel and no good, and managed to make a good impression on the innkeeper because of that. She ended up taking quite a liking to the players, and they came up with a pretty good plan on how to abduct Rowan and then interrogate him. The Warlock player had taken Demiplane as his 8th level spell, and this would give them their own pocket dimension where they could interrogate him at will with virtually no chance of discovery or interruption, and no real way for Rowan to even escape. The plan was pretty solid. It wasn't what I intended, but I just decided to roll with it and see where things went. The players managed to kidnap Rowan, took him to the Pocket Universe, and began interrogating him. But Rowan's alibi was pretty good, and I must have done a fairly good job of role-playing him, because the players went from being 90% sure that this is the guy to suddenly being like, I don't know, I think we got the wrong guy here. The only thing was, the Ranger player had clued into the fact that Rowan's timeline of events was slightly off from the timeline they themselves had established by interviewing the people at the asylum. And this would lead him to decide there's one thing we haven't looked at yet, and that's Rowan's room at the inn. They had already made a good impression with the innkeeper. They went to the inn and managed to convince her to let them into Rowan's room as long as, they didn't tell any of the guests, because she realized it would probably be bad for business if she was letting people into the guest room. The players searched the room, or 2 of the players did. 2 players remained with Rowan, but the rogue and the ranger went to the inn, searched the room, and underneath the bed they found a large travel bag. They pulled it out, opened the bag, found a bunch of mundane type of items like clothing and extra strings for his lute and stuff like that, and I think a flute and a couple other small instruments. But they also found a cloak that was wrapped up, and when they unwrapped the cloak, inside was a scalpel and a white porcelain mask with a single teardrop under one eye that was actually a sapphire. They had found the Weeping Man, and now had the confirmation they needed that Rowan was indeed the killer. They returned back to their gateway into their park at the mansion and confronted Rowan with the mask and the new evidence they had. Rowan tried to resist for a while, but one of the players actually chopped off one of his fingers in order to try to interrogate him. And this is where things got really weird, because it had occurred to me while planning the scenario that maybe Rowan's plan of joining the party might go wrong somewhere, and I kind of wanted Rowan to be one of the main villains at the end of the story. And rather than cheapening the players by just having Rowan somehow escape no matter what, it occurred to me, what if this wasn't the real Rowan? What if it was a simulacrum of Rowan? And what if the simulacrum didn't even know that he wasn't the real Rowan? And so when the players chopped off Rowan's finger, rather than it beginning to bleed, it turned to ice and started to melt. The players began to freak out, and then Rowan began to freak out, which was very interesting to the players because they suddenly realized that there was more weird stuff going on than even they'd suspected up till this point. They ended up finally managing to force Rowan to kind of reveal what his plan was and how he was the one that had killed her, and they were looking for the sister, but Rowan didn't know where the sister was either. They did discover that Rowan and the sister, the Ivory Queen, had been former lovers at one point, but Rowan hadn't actually been able to find her either. So basically, this coming to a dead end as well, the players killed fake Rowan and decided to return to the girl's father to let her know what they had found. They also showed him the series of pictures that they'd found. One of them, of course, being the abandoned church. He identified the church as being a place that the two girls used to go and play when they were young. And he talked about how they'd had to be on the run from the cult for several years and they'd moved around a lot. But after the Scarlet Queen had been sent to the asylum, he couldn't really keep moving if he wanted to be able to stay near here and make sure that she was being cared for. And so he'd been forced to basically stay here and look after her. The sister, of course, had moved on because she knew that she was still being hunted. By pinpointing the location on the player's map of where this old church was, the players now had a clue as to where the sister might be. They ended up going there, fighting some of the Golden Queen's minions along the way, managed to find the sister, which was also kind of hidden because one of the things that they discovered as well was that she was in a room inside another room that was hidden from view, but she was watching. The players managed to search the entire cathedral, found nothing, but then one of them decided to use detected invisibility. They'd found an invisible chest in one corner of the room, and inside that chest was a scroll of Demiplane. She was hiding in her own pocket dimension, and the players were able to use the scroll, open the gateway to her dimension, and team up with her. And that was the end of Act 1. I'll skim over Act 2 and 3 real quickly just so you can see how the story ends, but basically Act 2 involved the players and the Ivory Queen traveling through different dimensions into the astral plane, through the planes of Acheron, fighting their way past an army of demons and devils in the Blood War. They ended up fighting a Balor, but managed to eventually make their way to the River Styx, found the boatman, paid him to take them to a gateway into the city of Sigil. And so they traveled Styx until they reached the portal. He opened it up. They went into the city of Sigil, also known as the City of Doors. There they met an NPC that I'd created named the Beggar King. They made a bargain with him to trade some mummified hand to him in exchange for the key to open up a portal into a different realm known as the Fugue Plane, where Dendar the Night Serpent lives. The mummified hand ended up being the Hand of Vecna, of course, but that wasn't really relevant to this campaign. It'll probably be relevant if I ever go back to these characters later, though. They managed to go to the Fugue Plane, confronted Dendar the Night Serpent. It turned out that one of the reasons that the Scarlet Queen had gone mad was because in her dreams she had seen the King in Yellow. And at one point she had removed his mask and seen whatever cosmic horror lies beyond it, and that's what had driven her mad. But one night in her cell, in a moment of lucidity, she tried to make contact with Dendar. Dendar exists to basically feed on the nightmares of humanity, and she eats our nightmares, which make her stronger, but also keep humans from being overwhelmed by the accumulation of nightmares throughout their life, and helps us to stay sane. Unfortunately, Dendar is also this like Armageddon Midgardian serpent type creature that will one day eventually wake to destroy the sun and will end up fighting all these gods. And if she wins, then she destroys the entire universe type thing. But the Scarlet Queen had traded away her nightmares in exchange, she thought, for her sanity. But Dendar had kind of cheated her and had kind of stolen a lot of other information as well, including the key of how to re-imprison the King in Yellow. The players were able to trade their own nightmares that they'd been having throughout the campaign till now to Dendar in exchange for the Elder Sign that they would need to re-imprison the king. They returned back to their own world, eventually went to Carcosa, the imprisoned plane of the Yellow King, but also like his stronghold or his fortress essentially, and had the big showdown with the enemy forces, which included the Golden Queen, the real Rowan, her high priest, who was like a 15th level cleric, her great vizier, who was a 15th level wizard. I threw in a 15th level assassin just so the rogue would have kind of like his own personal nemesis. And I threw in the Master of the Hunt, who was a 15th level ranger, just to give the ranger a player his own personal nemesis. They also had like a couple hundred regular zombies, which are essentially just cannon fodder, but existed so that the players couldn't just bum rush the Golden Queen and overwhelm her with melee attacks. What ended up resulting was a very memorable battle, including one round of combat where 5 separate people were all counterspelled in one round. It was just this huge magical duel on both sides with everybody counterspelling everybody else. And it ended up being pretty good. The highlight ended up being when the rogue player managed to critically hit the royal assassin and one-shotted him, and then on his very next attack had managed to use his Mage Slayer dagger as a reaction to attack the Golden Queen and critically hit her as well, killing her off. At that point, she'd already been wounded. She had foresight on her, though, which made her a nasty opponent, gave her advantage in all her attack rolls and saving throws, as well as disadvantage to be hit. But one of the players had finally managed to hit her with a spell that had cancelled out the effects of foresight, and then the rogue managed to land the critical hit, which won the players the day. Now, when I look back on this campaign, I see a lot of things that I'd originally had planned out in my head, sort of, that didn't go according to plan. But I didn't necessarily script out a story as much as I planned different scenes. And so the players kind of scripted the story themselves as they went. I didn't mean for Rowan to get captured. He was supposed to join the group. But he did get captured, and he got interrogated. Rowan was actually going to try to frame one of the other NPCs for the murder, but he didn't even have a chance to do that because the players had suspected him so early and had grabbed him right off. And some people might think, well, it's kind of unfortunate that the players immediately suspected the real murder victim, which is maybe true. But the fact is that it ended up being a great game with great scenes. And the players chopping off his finger, and then it turning to ice and starting to melt, and everyone, Rowan included, freaking out, was something that really set the stage for the rest of the game. The players were also very, very resourceful in the way that they used their spells, I thought. They were not exactly expecting the spells to hand them all the answers, but they weren't frustrated or angry when the spells didn't immediately give them the results they wanted either. And I think this is one of the important things about understanding these spells. Sure, the Scarlet Queen wasn't able to identify Rowan as the killer, but her telling the players that she'd been murdered by the Weeping Man ended up being crucial information, because when they did find the mask, it confirmed that Rowan was the guy. Also, the players had asked other questions as well, and going into it, I thought to myself, if the players have 5 questions, I should probably figure out 6 or 7 different answers to, in case I'm wrong on some of the questions they ask. But I already knew one question was going to be who killed you, and another one was going to be where is your sister, because those were the 2 questions the players had been charged with trying to answer ever since the beginning. So that really meant I only needed to guess what the last 3 questions were going to be, and I think I got 1 or 2 out of the 3 right. I kind of just winged the answers to the other ones. They ended up not being so important. The players had gotten the information they needed, and they managed to find the clues that they wanted as well. So now I want to talk about some of the specific rules and guidelines that kind of help to govern these types of adventures in general, and I'll probably refer back to that as well as some other examples as well. But number one is going to be to limit the number of red herrings. I know that throwing red herrings at players may seem like a great idea for the Dungeon Master, but I've been in games where there are more red herrings than clues, and you can't be upset as a Dungeon Master if the players don't figure out the mystery that you're spinning for them, if there's more misdirection than actual direction. The players are not Sherlock Holmes. They are not, Perry Mason. The players are going to have to try to assemble the clues that you've given them in order to make a narrative. And more often than not, players will jump to conclusions as to what that narrative is, and if it's the wrong conclusion, it can be very hard to dissuade them and lead them back into the right direction. I'm not saying don't use any red herrings, but if you have more than one for every clue, that's probably not a great idea. Another thing is to prepare in advance. It would have been really easy for the players to just murder Rowan and for my story to go tragically wrong if it hadn't occurred to me, what if they murder Rowan and the story was tragically wrong? Because I prepared for that scenario, I was able to come up with something that ended up being one of the more interesting and memorable scenes of the entire game, them realizing that Rowan wasn't the real Rowan. And it allowed me to use Rowan at the end and have this villain that had come back. Because as things played out, the players never actually met the Golden Queen until the final battle at the end. They'd heard about her, they knew what her plans were now, they knew that she was the big threat trying to awaken the King in Yellow, but they'd never actually met her. But with Rowan, they now had a recurring villain. And they didn't feel that I'd cheated them, because ever since the beginning, it wasn't the real Rowan. And the players realized this once they realized that he was the simulacrum. So the players didn't feel cheated. I didn't have to pull some sort of the bad guy escapes because, or anything like that. The players had the satisfaction of feeling that they'd solved that part of the mystery, because they had, and yet I was still able to use him at the end for the big climatic battle. And it ended up being almost a perfect scenario. I couldn't have scripted a better ending battle than that. Who would have thought the rogue was going to double critical hit people? But I also knew that it was important to have a backup plan. And so even if Rowan hadn't ended up being involved, the story still could have gone ahead. I just kind of wanted him to be there. And that brings me to another point as well. If you have, let's say, a low-level adventure, and maybe there's a giant storm and everybody's at the inn and they're all trapped, and then somebody ends up getting murdered, and you expect the players are going to try to solve the murder, but maybe they miss some of the crucial clues, or maybe one of the NPCs lies to them about their motivations and the players believe this NPC for whatever reason and don't think to question their story. You need to have a way to bring things back on track. If the players have hit a dead end and they're not picking up what you're putting down, then you need to have some other way to keep things in line. One of my personal favorites is to just have the killer try to make a move. Maybe he's upset that the players are investigating him. Maybe he starts worrying that they're getting too close. And so he decides to make a play and tries to assassinate one of the players in the night. This can keep things going. Maybe he sends somebody else to assassinate them, and you can arrange for the players to then capture that person and interrogate them to find out who'd sent them. It doesn't necessarily have to be the killer taking direct action either. Maybe the players miss your obvious clue that was left in the fireplace with a partly burnt piece of paper that you thought the players would search for and find quite easily. They don't. But maybe later they go down to the bar to have a drink. You could have one of the NPCs there mention the same information that you'd wanted them to find, just as a way of getting them back on track. Maybe they're like, players buy the person a drink, getting good with them, the person gets kind of drunk, and then they kind of let slip that they heard a disturbance the other night in their next door room. And the players say, wait, that's the room where the person was killed. And then the investigation could go back on track again. Or maybe they end up talking to someone like, say, the maid, who they don't necessarily suspect, but she mentioned something strange too, that an item from one room was found in a different room when she was cleaning, and so she'd returned it to the original room. This can clue the players in that someone had come from this other room And if they figure out who was in that room, it tells them who was now in the room with the dead body. These kind of things can be pretty easy, and they can also be fairly subtle, but you sort of need to have some of these ideas in mind before you go in. If you're trying to improv at all and just think on the fly, you're probably going to make mistakes. And this kind of leads to the whole problem, I think, with a lot of these types of scenarios. They can be extremely challenging for the dungeon master, but they can also be extremely rewarding. They're a very high risk, high reward type of scenario. Because as a player, it's rather dissatisfying to just be like, oh, I rolled a 24 on my intelligence roll, what did I find? It's much more satisfying to be able to actually put the pieces together yourself and solve the case. You actually feel like you've accomplished something because you actually have. You didn't just roll well on one dice roll. But in order for the scenario to work as planned, you as the dungeon master need to be able to plan and prepare in advance and have a backup plan. The other thing that I want to kind of focus on here towards the end of this video is going to be, don't nullify the player choices. You might think that you have this perfect scenario where event A is going to lead to B, and B is going to lead to C, and C is going to lead to the giant conclusion at point D. But things went wrong at point A. And now you're kind of lost. Or you think that, well, in order for the story to proceed, I have to lead the players to point B. I have to somehow force that to happen. That's not necessarily the case. Nullifying player choices is just going to make them feel frustrated. If they try to use Speak with Dead or Detect Thoughts to find the killer, and you just decide, oh, well, it just doesn't work because, then the player's going to feel cheated. And rightly so. The player took things like Speak with Dead or Detect Thoughts or Contact Other Plane or other type divination spells specifically for this purpose. You don't get mad when the wizard uses Fireball to clear out all the evil villain's henchmen in one shot, because you knew that was the purpose of Fireball. And if you design the encounter without thinking about Fireball, you kind of realize, oh yeah, I should have thought of that, and it's my fault. I kind of blame the dungeon master if you designed your murder scenario and didn't think about spells like Speak with Dead or Detect Thoughts. Those are part of the game, and you need to be prepared for them. But they don't have to be game breaking, and you don't have to eliminate them from your game, is what I'm trying to say. Maybe you don't have to do the whole mask thing like I did with Speak with Dead, but maybe the victim gets killed from behind, and now they cast Speak with Dead, and they're like, I didn't see the guy, they killed me from behind. But perhaps this is a way of bringing out other useful information. Maybe the victim was murdered outside, and you thought the players would see the water tracks that were from the body being dragged from the outside, inside, and set in a specific room. But the players completely missed that clue. They decided to just go straight to Speak with Dead, and the victim could now say that they were murdered outside in the garden. And the players are like, well, that's strange, because you're not outside in the garden. You're here in this specific room. And it'll tell the players the information that you'd expected them to find in the first place, but completely missed. Another thing with Detect Thoughts to remember is that it only gives players surface thoughts. Again, this doesn't have to be a bad thing. If you had some clue that you expected they were going to interrogate some witness and then find out about it, or that somebody knew about somebody else's gambling problem, and maybe somebody was putting leverage on that guy because of his gambling problem, and he owes money to somebody else, and the players missed all this, Detect Thoughts can be a useful way for the players to find this kind of stuff again. There's a webpage called The Alexandrian, and one of the things that they talk about is the 3-clue rule. But I'm going to actually take that one step further. If you have a crucial piece of information that the players need to know, 3 clues isn't necessarily enough. You might need to literally hand them that crucial piece of information and then build mystery around that. Maybe you tell them that the killer was from out of town, and now the players have to investigate and try to find out who it is. Maybe the killer's not necessarily obviously from out of town. Maybe they have to investigate and try to get the person into different scenarios and eventually realize this guy has a slight accent that we hadn't noticed before because they've been living here for a long time or whatever. The point is that these things can help the players get back on track when they've missed crucial information, and can help you to lead the game to where you want to go. The final thing I'm going to say is that things need to pay off. If you describe the murder scene and there's a fireplace and there's a mantle above it with a statue of a cat and there's a portrait on the wall, and then you describe there's like a coat hanger and there's a bunch of jackets on it or whatever, almost all those things need to be relevant. If the players decide to search the coats and the coat hanger, maybe there's some sort of rolled up note in one of the pockets that the players will need. Maybe there's something in the fireplace. Like I said before, maybe someone had thrown the crucial documents in and let them burn. But enough of it managed to survive that the players can use that as a clue. Maybe the cat statue was the murder weapon, and the killer just grabbed whatever was close at hand. It wasn't necessarily premeditated. They just grabbed the nearest hard object. Or maybe there's a key underneath the cat statue that doesn't fit anything in this room, cluing the players in that there's something they're going to have to find that this key will be needed for. Maybe the portrait above the fireplace was of some relative, and the murderer is, the illegitimate child of this noble hanging on the fireplace. And the players might be able to notice the resemblance, and suddenly this clues them in as to motive or whatever else. I don't think it's wrong to have an extra couple items in the room as red herrings. I think that adds a bit of realism to things. But if you have 10 items in the room and 8 of them are useless, that's probably too much. I would want at least 4 or 5 of those things to be relevant to the story I'm trying to tell. So hopefully this has brought us to a point where I can kind of wrap up this video. I know it's gone a little long. I also want to apologize. Future videos will hopefully not always have my boring bedroom in the background. I actually wanted to film them in the other room, but my daughter is currently playing soccer with a beach ball, and I thought this would probably not be the best backdrop. I forgot what I was saying. So just to conclude everything, I think that these types of scenarios can be a lot of fun. There's some of the most engaging and rewarding games I've had as both a player and as a dungeon master. But if you try to limit the players' choices, if you try to force a story to go to a place you want it to go and not let the players just kind of pick how they want to get there, then it's going to be a frustrating experience for everyone involved. So hopefully you can take this information and use it to enhance your own games and make them better. And don't be afraid to let the players just kind of run wild sometimes and try crazy things. Some of the best scenarios are just the players doing what they want to do and you just kind of rolling with the punches. They're probably going to have a lot more fun if they get to kidnap the evil bard and interrogate him than if you try to run things the way that you'd originally planned.